Yeah, Laura did.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Bridgetown Smurfit Stone Community Advisory Group. We're going to go ahead and start with some introductions. I'll start first. I'm Jerry Dellis, and I'm part of the CAG admin team, and we'll start over here.
Brian Barkoyak with the Natural Resource Damage Program.
Elena Evans.
Brianna Pass, the project manager.
Down in Aldrich.
Lenny Sims, second secretary. And Bridgetown, Museum.
Janie Smith with the National Paper.
Indian Phillips, GSI.
Sam Berkeley, GSI.
Yeah, we want from St. Regis, and I'm Senator. And Sam Coalition.
Madam Refugees Office.
David Chamberlain with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. Kevin Stone, Montana DEQ.
I'm Tess. Yeah, we're political science students at UM. We're just interested.
Yay.
Thanks for that.
And you are?
Great.
Hi,
So we shall invite a constituent representative and a member of the Confederated Civil Including Tribes.
Ethan Jam.
Oh, Elizabeth. Oh, thank you.
And Bruce Sims, CAG administrative team, and Bruce President. Where's
Good to see you. Okay, we'll go ahead and go online. MCAT is on. Laura, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Yeah, Laura Lundquist with Missoula Current. Hi, everybody.
Muted?
Can you hear me?
Hi, Trevor Selch with Fish, Wildlife and Parks out of Colony.
Can you admit Isabel? Brian? At my phone? No, I admitted her. Now I wonder if the sound is through the TV or.
Sound should be through the owl.
Trevor said the audio was really echoey, but.
I think I fixed that.
Oh.
Well,
Seems better.
It does
now.
sound better.
Better now. I think it's
Laura,
good.
can you say hi to us so I can hear you?
Yeah, this is Laura Lundquist with the Missoula Current. Sound good?
Okay, hold on. Believe it or not, this is a completely different setup than any setup we've had before. Why don't we have you introduce yourself too?
Sure.
Dr. David.
All right. We'll do that. And thanks to Elena and Brian for facilitating this with audio video. Appreciate that. So I'm David Tug. I work with GSI Environmental, and I went to school at U of M here. No,
We'll wait till we finish these introductions and then we'll get to you. Well, we'll move on to Ying.
Ying Yu, risk assessor at the PhD.
All right, we can't hear you guys, so I'm just going to roll down the list of attendees. Alex Myers, I'm not sure who you're with, but
Integral.
thank you. Catherine LaCourse is here. Chris Stark from CSKT. Isabel Nebel is DEQ.
Yep, you got it.
And Jake Garson is DEQ.
Jerry, that's the more things.
Hi, go ahead.
I'm Karen Hughes with County Planning.
Jonathan Carlin, State Representative.
Abby Sherwood, community member.
Great, it's good to see you.
This is last month's.
Sure.
No, we had all church.
Laura, we'll try that again. Can you say hi again? We'll see if we can hear.
Hello, everybody. How are you doing? Can you hear me?
Yes, yay, sweet, thank you. It's wonderful to have such great technical support. Thank you, Brian and Elena.
Oh, you're good, Jerry. You get what you pay for.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and read our mission statement, which is to serve as a trusted liaison between the community, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Montana Department of Environmental Quality by becoming informed, sharing this information with the public, and engaging in the Superfund process to ensure the restoration of the former Smurfit stone mill site to a healthy ecological state for future generations. We meet here the first meeting, or the first Thursday of the month. So here we are. And with that, we invited Dr. David Took of GSI Environmental to discuss some questions that were submitted. And I just would like to remind everybody that we want to stick to the 10 questions that were submitted. If there are additional questions, we'll go ahead and take those, and then that will be maybe at a later date or in an email or whatever your consideration is to answer those questions. If that's
Yep, I was
okay.
thinking we could do clarification questions during our conversation, and then if there's other questions, we can field those after.
Okay,
That works better.
and I'm assuming you have a copy of the questions, so I don't have to.
I have, yeah, well, I didn't grab your agenda, but I have, yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to you, and if we could, would you like to, if there's online questions during, how would you like to
Yeah,
go about that?
Jerry, and then we'll give them attention.
Brian, or we,
I can watch.
yeah, either one of us will. Okay, thank you.
Well, I went to school here. I finished up in 06. I worked for the mill between about 1999 and 2006 when they were in operations, and then went to work here in the community as an environmental consultant, and kind of came full circle around 2013, 2014 timeframe, and started helping the current owner operator at the Green facilitate the EVA's process as they entered the preliminary assessment, the pulp mill site, and then ultimately started working with West Rock International Paper to help them navigate this whole process. And today, Steve Hamilton is with us from West Rock, and Jamie Smith from International Paper, and I'll name a few other folks that are here helping, both from individual and for GSI. But Steve can maybe give you a couple of minutes here of his background.
Yeah, Steve Hamilton with West Rock. I am semi-retired with them as of last September. I was Senior Director of Environmental Affairs for the company. Been doing this kind of work for the last 46 years. Managed the company's remedial activities across North America. Done a number of mill site assessments, at least 12 for the US and Canada, so I've got a lot of experience. Unfortunately, in mill closure, which is something you never desire to do, but that's kind of my general background. I also, with this mill specifically, started working with it in 2000, and have been coming here consistently ever since then.
Jamie.
Yeah, so I'm Janie Smith with International Paper. I've been working for IP for coming up on 3 years, and in that I'm working on this Frenchtown project in the same amount of time. But prior to that, I've got 12 years of experience on assessment or remediation of contaminated sites across the country. So not quite as lengthy of a tenure as Steve, but been working on it a while.
And where are you at?
I live in Pensacola, Florida.
Thank you.
And GSI works with Steve and Jamie to facilitate the remedial investigation and feasibility study process and conduct those studies. And so India Phillips works with me directly. She helps me coordinate this with a number of other resources at GSI, and Sam Turklehammer as well. And both of them have done a lot of data collection work at the site over the last several years. And then online, Alex Myers is on from Integral Consulting. They've helped us, they've helped facilitate risk assessment at the site, and Heather Summers as well with Integral Consulting. And EPA, though, is conducting the risk assessment for the site, but of course we're collecting the data and it all gets funneled into risk assessment. Those folks help us to interpret those data and risk calculations. All right. Hopefully. So we had collected some questions from the KEG from Jerry back in June, and to ensure that we had some topics that we could cover that the KEG was most interested in hearing about. And we took those questions and organized them, categorized them to some extent, consolidated those into this list of topics here. So we'll be answering your questions, but really in this series of topics. So we'll start with site overview and then look into the process itself of investigating the site. And then the site conceptual model really is a little bit of detail about the data that have been collected over the last 10 years at the site. And then there's some next steps that we're in the middle of as we move toward remediation of the site. And then, of course, there are a number of questions, and I believe they're on your agenda, about how stakeholders can be involved in this whole process. And, so we'll try to facilitate answers to those as well. Well, as you know, there's lots of parties involved in this whole process of investigating the site and identifying remedial alternatives. And EPA, first and foremost, is overseeing this project with support from the Montana DEQ. And Allie Archer, who you most likely all met in person, is the remedial project manager for EPA, and she's supported by many people at EPA, plus consultants at EA Consulting, and SRC does the risk assessment work for the EPA. The DEQ, Brianna Paps is here today, and they also provide oversight and critical review of all work plans and material that's generated, data interpretations for the site. She's here, and she's supported by Haley and Aldrich, and Donovan is here today from Haley and Aldrich. And then we've gone through the folks involved so far with what we're calling performing parties at the site. So the previous owner-operators, West Rock and International Paper, are conducting the remedial investigation at the site and will conduct a feasibility study for the site. But that is all overseen by these other agencies. Here's a snapshot on the left of where you are. Everyone knows where they are here today. We're not far from the site, of course. It's an enormous site, and that map would be better shown with respect to Missoula too. Initially it was a 3,200 acre site. Some portions of the site, especially on the eastern side, have been sold to local farmers and ranchers. But much of the site is still under ownership from M2 Green Corporation and more recently MLH. So there's about 3,000 acres that are currently being investigated at the site, and those were divided early in this process into 3 operable units. There's a unit on the east side of the site, which is yellow, operable unit 1, and it's represented primarily by farm and ranch lands. No mill operations were conducted on those properties. And in the pink area there, operable unit 2 is the former industrial complex. And it's everything from a log yard and chip storage all the way through pulping and paper making and shipping and delivery. So it's actually, that pink area is larger than the actual footprint of the core industrial area. But and then OU3, operable unit 3, is largely the former wastewater treatment system. They had a large open wastewater treatment system that had primary and secondary treatment facilities, and then they stored water, treated water over much of that area, and then they had a discharge permit that they operated under for the larger part of the mine life, or the site life. Do mining on the site, so apparently my head is stuck in mining. So, So you can see the wastewater treatment area is comprised of somewhere in the ballpark of 1,500 acres. And some of that's in the floodplain, and some of it's outside the floodplain. And you can kind of see in this picture the outline, sort of a blue shaded outline, and that designates the floodplain. The floodplain's to the left-hand side of that, or to the western side of that outline, and then the green area to the right, or to the eastern side of that outline is outside the floodplain. All of the primary treatment components of the wastewater treatment system, so settling, and then all of the secondary treatment, so, and then in this case it was aeration, were conducted outside the floodplain. The only treatment system components in the floodplain were storage, and that was storage of treated water that was compliant with discharge permit requirements. I guess another notable component here, operable unit 1, risk assessments were conducted there, stream level risk assessments were conducted in OU1 early in this process, and completed in 2017. And risks to human health and the ecosystem were not identified in OU1. And so that has sort of stood since then with that conclusion. And much of the investigation since 2017 has continued in OU2 and OU3. And so risk assessment work going forward is separated into OU2 and OU3 risk assessments. And there are both ecological and human health risk assessments for OU2 and OU3. Those were initially produced and published in 2021, and those are right now under review with some additional data, and they will be updated as needed pending the outcome of those additional data. And we'll get to that here in a minute. So a brief history here, and more directed at current events. The site operated from 1957 to 2010, or really to the end of 2009. And then in 2011, EPA and DEQ did begin to get involved with some preliminary investigations at the site. And those investigations have slowly led into a remedial investigation, feasibility study process under CERCLA guidelines. And so in 2014, a focused site inspection was done by what is now GSI on behalf of M2 Green. And then in 2015, West Rock International Paper and M2 Green entered into an agreement with the EPA. It's an administrative order on consent. And that outlined the entire process, a detailed process of conducting a remedial investigation. And that investigation has continued through, in general, the end of 2024, although we did more work in June of this year to support the feasibility study primarily. Risk assessments were completed initially in 2021, and then the EPA is currently looking at the additional data to determine if risk assessments need to be revised or updated prior to entering into a feasibility study phase. And we're in the position now where we think we could conduct a feasibility study and within 2 or 3 years, and we could be at a point where we're proposing a remediation plan in around 2028, 2029 timeframe. So the little timeline across the top is just something we saw off the internet for a CERCLA process, and we just applied each of these benchmarks to that timeline. And one other thing to point out is the community involvement component of this entire process spans the process. The community was involved way back in 2011. The community was involved during operations, but in 2011 as part of this CERCLA process, and it will continue. And in the next significant comment period in this community involvement process is with that proposed plan, prior to any remedial decisions being made. So this is another way to look at that CERCLA process timeline. A bit more of a roadmap style. And one of the questions from the CAG was whether or not the site has been adequately characterized. Is there enough data for us to move on to the next phases of the site? And the general answer to that question is yes, we think so. The two reasons you go out and investigate are to determine the nature and extent of any constituents of concern that exist on the site, And then use those data to serve risk assessments, calculate the potential risk to human health and the ecosystem. And then use that information then to feed into identifying remedial action objectives. So what are our objectives for cleaning up the site if it needs cleaning up? That's all driven by risks at the site. And then from those objectives, we determine a list of alternatives, all alternatives, spanning from do nothing to do everything to clean up the site. Remove everything, do nothing. And we just list them. And then we go through and systematically test those alternatives. Which ones are feasible? How are they feasible? And there's a number of criteria we'll use to determine feasibility of those alternatives. And then they'll be ranked, and preferred ones will be selected, and then those will be proposed in a remedy. And then we'll go through and EPA and the PRPs and the stakeholders will all take a look at that and say, yeah, that looks reasonable or that looks unreasonable, and you may have to go back to the drawing board or you may move forward. And then the EPA will determine a record of decision. They'll say, yeah, we like this proposed plan for remediation, let's execute. And so then we execute the remedial action, and then you go back and test it. You test it at first every year for bits and pieces of it every year to make sure it's effective, and then you operate on 5-year review periods. You make sure that it's effective and that the remedy is doing what it's supposed to be doing to protect human health and the environment. So those are the nuts and bolts of the process, and we think at this point we've collected a lot of data to support that initial investigation, the nature and extent, and support risk assessment, and that's where we are today. We're in this phase of remedial investigation and risk assessment and feasibility study. The other thing about this process is it's very iterative. In the event you discover something that you missed or didn't even know you missed, you go back a step. Maybe you have to do a targeted or focused investigation to solve a problem or investigate a remedial alternative, and then you move forward again. So we're following guidance supplied by the EPA, and then we're conducting this entire process under the oversight of the EPA and DEQ. There was another question regarding the process and whether there's adequate information, and it had to do with the fish consumption. And so I didn't build a slide for that one. It's sort of out of order. It's deeper. But the CAG had asked when would this fish advisory be lifted? And it really is in the purview of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and more recently with CSKT. And so we would default to any questions about the fish advisory to those groups. There were questions specifically about the pace of the remediation investigation, or remedial investigation. And it's gone on for a long time. It's not unusual for an RAFS to take a long time. It can take as little as 5 years, it can take as many as 30 years. And as I said before, in some circumstances, you get into the remedy and then you end up having to go back and make some adjustments. And so you're into an investigation stage at times again. This site we've been doing a remedial investigation in earnest since 2015, perhaps 2014. And by the end of 2024, we're very confident we have sufficient data to conduct risk calculations. There were specific questions about why the last couple of years of data have taken so long to collect. In 2023, we executed a work plan, which was in response to a community request. We go out there and look at things more closely. And more specifically, they asked that we look at PCB congeners and that we look at the spatial and the temporal distribution of some of the constituents that have been observed out at the site. And so we had written work plans. We wrote work plans in 2022 and 2023, and then began executing in the fall of 2023 with groundwater, and completed those at the end of October in terms of data collection, at the end of October in 2024. Then it took us from then until April to get all the data from the laboratory. So that was one of the biggest reasons we had a delay more recently. is the lab turnaround times were exceptionally long during that period of time. And then I would also say that this process is slowed a bit through the planning process. It's really important that we plan so that we execute data collection directly in response to the objectives or to the scientific questions that are asked before we go out. And then on the other end of the spectrum, once you get the data from the laboratory, it takes a while to ensure that those data are valid and usable to make decisions from. And so during that process, sometimes you discover discrepancies in the data set. You discover problems with laboratory data or perhaps problems with sampling itself, and you have to resolve those. And in this process, we have a mechanism for doing that. We write a corrective action report, we inform the EPA of the discrepancy, and then we work together to create a resolution. And even for the 2024 data, we're still working through a few resolutions with the agencies. But largely, those data are available and present in a project database, which is available to the public. They've been validated, and we're dealing with a couple minor resolutions, discrepancy resolutions. Oh, also, we do kick out a monthly progress report to the EPA, and that lands on the public record, which reveals any discrepancies, problem solutions, deviations that we've encountered along the way, and then it also updates progress on data collection, data organization, and reporting. And it lays out what our intentions are for the next couple of months as well.
Just a quick clarifying question. As you work through those remaining few QA/QC resolutions, will that result in changes or different flags associated with data that's already in Scribe, or will that result in additional data being uploaded to Scribe?
Yeah, so normally we would resolve those before we upload to Scribe, right? So my answer is it probably will not result in any changes to qualification flags in the Scribe database.
Okay.
However, one of the issues we ran into was what appears to be incorrect data. It appeared to be anomalous data that we reran from the same samples, and we got entirely different results. And so right now, both data points are in the database. So we'll work with EPA and DEQ and pick the one that makes the most sense. So while the lab's quality assurance, quality control data would suggest that either of them are valid, we have other reasons to invalidate them. And those decisions haven't been made. So that's what needs to be resolved. But right now, yeah, there's a couple data points that might be rejected from the database. But even in this Scribe database, we'll R flag them, but leave them in.
So what does QA and QC is quality control?
Yes.
What's a QA?
Quality assurance.
Okay, thank you.
So quality assurance is generally the methods you use to ensure it's like basically following standardized best practices to make sure that you collect samples that are representative of the material you're trying to test. And then quality control are physical samples you collect to be able to show that you can replicate your results in a precise and accurate manner. But quality control is an actual data set. Quality assurance is largely the methods and procedures that you use. Okay, I might be going a bit slow here.
Okay, it's a lot.
We're going to get through this. Okay, so lots of stuff's been done on the site. We have this map on the left, which isn't the type of map you would put out as a figure normally, but it's informational in the very, at the least. So there's been many locations where soils, waters, tissue samples, or biological samples, sediment samples have all been collected, and we try to quantify those a bit here. So over the last 10, 11 years, those are the number of samples that have been collected, and those result in many, many more results than samples, because in many circumstances you're collecting you might collect 20 metals for one sample, so that would explain why there are over 216,000 results for somewhere in the ballpark of 1,800 samples collected at the site. But so volume isn't the question. And then also, a lot of these samples have been collected at locations more than once. So there's a network of groundwater wells, and we've collected samples from some of those locations 15 or 16 times. to look at changes in concentration over time. So first and foremost, a lot of stuff's been collected here at the site. Okay, there's a general approach we take, and this is outlined in our initial work plan in 2015, where you first go out and review information about the site and determine where you're most likely to find contaminants at a site. And then you target your sampling approach toward those locations, because you're looking for places that are perhaps going to be the dirtiest or worst water quality at a site. And that helps you identify which constituents are of true concern and respective of former site operations. And then there's another approach you can take, and this one's often more directed toward risk assessment calculations. Both of them are used for risk assessment. This one is sometimes directed specifically for risk assessment purposes, and it's where you take area-wide samples, where you take numerous samples within a particular area. And in that case, you're sort of looking for, you're not specifying, oh, I think there's contamination here. You're saying, in this grid cell or in this pond, is there anything in here that is of concern? And so I take a whole bunch of samples, and I might composite those, might not composite them. And in this case, we're showing those sort of on the right-hand side, where you have these grid cells and we have a whole bunch of dots in them, where we bucket individual samples or composite samples. We use both of these approaches at the site. I want that to be really clear. And a lot of the work that was done at the site really was in the first box. It was the targeted sample, because we were really, you're often trying to find, well, what is the worst thing out here first? And then let's work our way back to where did that come from and where is it going? And is it going to be a problem in the future? So here's another slide kind of showing the general approach. And this is directed more toward a targeted approach than a systematic approach. But when we're looking at a contaminant in a system, we're looking for the source of that contaminant, for its receptor, and then how did it get there? How does it get from the source to a receptor? And does it change along the way? And at this site, this is a little cartoon example. We're showing pond 3 in this case, and we're showing what direction groundwater flows. And we're showing that for some of these basins at the site, there's pond materials or former pond settled materials that are in contact with groundwater at least part of the year. And there's the potential for constituents in those ponds to then migrate into the water and move with the water in a particular direction. And so much of the work that was done at the site did a couple of things. We had multiple different events where we went out and collected samples at different depths from the surface, various intervals, sometimes composites, but one way or another, many different holes in the ground on the site, throughout the entire site. And that tells us whether things migrate from top to bottom or whether they're perhaps even just present at depth because they were deposited there to begin with. But are they there or not? And are they there at different depths? And then it also helps us understand whether they're moving from the soils into the groundwater. And then we're measuring the groundwater itself over time and space using wells. And that helps us also understand, did something mobilize to the well? And if it did, where did it come from? So if it shows up at a well, we start looking up gradient from that well to figure out where it came from. So we're just giving an example here, but this is something we did all over the site. And more recently, we've called this type of study, or we've focused this study in an area we're calling Transect C. We've got this transect across the site that went through background materials, through the industrial area. It goes through the primary settling basins, and then it goes into the storage basins, and then eventually crosses the river. And so we're looking at that transect in particular as being analogous to other locations at the site. We have looked at multiple transects throughout the site, but that one we've spent a lot of time focusing on to make sure we understand where constituents are, how they're mobilizing. And I left out all the words, realizing that India helped put animations in here. So again, you review about the site, make sure you know where you're going, you do a bunch of planning. You go out there and test the source, most likely source, and then you start to look for things moving and then where are they landing? Down gradient. And this is also a really useful way to look for a needle in a haystack. So if there is contamination up gradient and you don't know exactly where it is, but it's a contaminant that moves in water. You can look in the water, and if you find it, you're like, well, there must be something up gradient that's causing it to be there. And so then you can go looking for that needle. But if you just went out and looked for the needle, you might have a hard time finding it. You may never find it. Okay, so at the site, the map on the right, I realize it's small. This is actually a figure from a recent report coming out, and it's good because it lays out all these locations that we've installed in the last 11 years or so. So far, we've installed 38 wells since we started in 2014. 2015, I think, is when we started installing wells. But in addition to that, there were a whole bunch of wells out there, monitoring wells that the mill had installed to monitor their wastewater system. And we took advantage of those wells, made sure that they were producing representative data, and then we took advantage of their locations. So we've been monitoring them. So we have, 15, like I said, sometimes we have as many as 20 data points from any given well if we think it's important. And in addition to that, we've installed at 14 different groundwater locations. We have about 20 of these transducers out there, but at 14 groundwater locations, we put continuous monitors in. We're monitoring specific conductance, which is sort of it's sort of a proxy for water quality. And then we monitor water level and temperature as well in those. So we can see how the water table, how the groundwater is changing over time, and then how many constituents are in it over time. This is a slide to talk about what we've been doing in the river at the site. We've, over the course of, starting in about 2015, we started collecting data in the river, and we did a whole bunch this last year. And went back in many cases to the same locations that we've renamed them. But we've been looking at surface water and sediment in the Clark Fork River and the Bitterroot River from upstream of Missoula all the way down to, what's our furthest point? Maybe India remembers. I forget what our last downstream point is at this time. This is obviously not to scale, but with a number of sites adjacent to the river. And the whole idea is that you get some concept of the water quality and sediment quality up gradient of the site, adjacent to the site, and down gradient from the site. So you can see, are there any changes to concentrations in the river from the site itself?
David, is there a difference between the triangles and the circles?
Yeah, triangles, I believe, are sediment locations, and circles are water locations. Yeah, good question. Also, what's not shown on here is all the tributary samples that we collected. Go ahead.
Yeah, did your monitoring start before Milltown Dam went out?
Let's see. Yeah, when did Milltown Dam?
2008.
Oh yeah, so well after that.
Sounds about right.
So we kind of talked about soils and how we go about investigating those, and groundwater, how we investigate that, and then that was surface water sediment in the river. This slide is just to point out that in this initial process, and this was partway through the remedial investigation process, we found some PCB air chlors in 2 locations in the industrial area. And working with EPA and DEQ, we elected to go ahead and remove those soils. They exceeded a residential standard. They did not exceed commercial standards at the site, but we felt like at the time, yeah, we're on the right track here. We've collected these samples using this approach, discovered that there were some contaminants up in the industrial area, and it was worth going ahead and doing a removal response action. So it's sort of an early version of what's coming at a much more detailed level.
David, was that in collaboration or same when MRL did their?
This was before.
Oh, it was before
Yep.
that. Okay.
Yep, MRL entered their own AOC with EPA and did a removal on a rail spur at the site as well. Yep. But same concept, focused investigation led to a response action, and then that was executed. Yeah, and in this case, the PRPs removed about 155 yards of material. And they were in two locations. One was a tank foundation, and the tank didn't have PCBs in it by any means. We think that some fill was placed in there that had PCBs in it. We found PCBs in two locations, there and then at the transformer storage facility in and around that in the soil. So there are places you would expect to find it. And by the way, for PCBs at the site, at least airflow PCBs, we looked everywhere there would be a potential hydraulic fluid spill. So hydraulic fluid spills and transformers, those are our indicators. We focused on those. If we found them there, then we go looking in more detailed places. But largely, we just didn't find them except happened to be in this tank foundation in that transformer building area.
Where did the waste go?
It went to like a Clean Harbors facility, or it went to, if Missoula landfill, I forget. If they had a line facility, it went to, yeah, it was treated as hazardous waste and then replaced with clean fill.
Thanks.
And there's a construction completion report on EPA's file to support that work. It's done in 2017. Okay, so let's get into the findings just a little bit. And these are very broad because there, as you can imagine, there is a lot of information that's been collected. There's a lot of information to share with the community. And these are in technical reports on EPA's website, and they are in the process of being all organized and consolidated into our mutual investigation report. And we are working on that heavily right now. And that's coming to the public within 12 months for sure, but hopefully earlier. Okay, so soils. We call this a conceptual site model because the whole point of going out and investigating a site is to figure out what's there and how far, what's the extent of them, of those constituents, and are they moving? And so originally, we pull a little bit of data together and you build a conceptual model. And then as you collect more and more data, you keep refining that conceptual model. So our findings are really, they're really just a conceptual model that gets better and better and better as we go. And in OU1, risk assessments, we conducted a bunch of soil work, risk assessments were done. Ultimately, there's no further action required in that operable unit. So our focus has been diverted more toward operable unit 2 and 3. And largely in operable unit 2, we're not finding soils that have constituents that exceed health guidelines, human health guidelines. And so much of the attention is now being diverted more toward OU3. Now, in OU2, the EPA is still reviewing information, and final risk assessments will be updated as needed here in the near future. But most of the findings for operable unit 2 will be reflected from the 2021 conclusions. And OU3 is the one place where we've done a bunch more spatial and temporal, we would say, data collection over time, and sort of filled in the gaps. And by filling in the gaps, we've added a number of constituents like PCB congeners. So initially, we went out there and evaluated aerochlores, which are big compounds that have a bunch of different individual PCB congeners. There's a whole bunch of PCB congeners, I think 209. And aerochlores are chemicals that were made of those individual congeners, different groupings of those. And so it's one way to look for PCBs. And the reason you start there is because those are the industrial chemicals most likely to have PCBs in them. But with the public's request, we've gone back and actually looked at the individual congeners, and not just all 209, but there are a list of coplanar, sort of smaller list of congeners that are most toxic. And those contribute to a broader number we call a TEQ, or a toxic equivalent value. And so they're grouped in with dioxins and furans. And so we can look at PCBs, we can look at the combination of the most toxic PCBs, and we can look at the dioxins and furans, and we can look at them together all within a TEQ value. And so by doing the congeners, it allowed us to make those calculations much cleaner. And so that was done in the last 2 years or so, all the congener we have a sort of a broad idea of what the PCB situation was out there, and now we have a much more detailed. And the EPA needs some time to look at the data that's been collected. Again, they are in the database. They're working through those, and they're looking at risk assessment updates as needed. But largely, throughout the site, inoperable Unit 3, we haven't seen organics. We'll find them in some localized areas. They're not moving into groundwater. There's nothing to cause them to move. They're not soluble in water. They're largely insoluble in water. And so if they're there, they don't move far.
Can you define what organics are?
In this case, thank you. It's in my notes and I skipped it. In this case, organics are all sorts of things. So dioxins, furans, PCBs, those are all considered organic constituents that we look at. But then also semi-volatile organic compounds and volatile organic compounds, which are largely petroleum compounds. And those include solvents. But that also includes things like pesticides and insecticides and herbicides. Those all fall into that category of compounds. And they're relatively sticky in the system. And so, again, I'm reverting back to the 2021 risk assessments, which did not identify those as being a risk at the site. Largely. There's limited contact with groundwater from the soils at the site. So when the site was in operation, there was a lot of water out there. They were using these basins to put water in, and that saturated all the earth underneath those all the way down to the shallow aquifer. But since the site's been closed, those ponds don't exist anymore. And so there's nothing causing that continuous contact between the soils and the aquifer beneath, the aquifer matrices beneath. Now, what does happen on an annual basis is that aquifer fluctuates up and down, right? So in the spring, snow melts, the whole aquifer comes up a few feet. And in the summer, the whole thing comes down a few feet. And it generally moves up and down with the river levels at the site. And so during parts of the year, that groundwater comes up high enough to get into the bottom of some of these sediment basins. And so we looked at that very closely. And that's why we say there's limited contact with groundwater. So there's limited opportunity for that groundwater to grab hold of constituents that are in those sediment basins at the site. And then you also have to recognize that for years and years and years, there was lots of water moving down into that aquifer, right? And so the whole system was being flushed for many, many years while it was operating. And so there's nothing spectacular about an annual system where you have water coming up into that material and back down, up into it and back down. It's the same material that was wet for a long time. Okay, so let's talk about that water a little bit. There's two different aquifers at the site. There's a shallow aquifer, which is about 30 feet deep, about 30 feet below ground surface throughout the site. And then there's a unit that's about 100 feet thick, and we call that a semi-permeable unit. And it's saturated. It has water in it, a lot of water in it, but the water doesn't move very well. There's a bunch of clays in there. It has a hard time moving laterally and vertically. And then beneath that, there is a prolific Missoula aquifer, and that is the aquifer that everybody's water supply wells are coming from. So the drinking water wells are in this deep, and those are about 120 feet below ground surface. There are no wells, no drinking water wells in that shallow aquifer, in that first 30 feet of the site. There are many monitoring wells. We've been checking it. There are very few. We think there's maybe one well that sits in that unit that doesn't move water. And there's good reason for that, right? It doesn't move water, so it's hard to get a sample out of it, and you certainly can't produce water out of it. And then there are production wells, drinking water wells, water supply wells in that deep aquifer. And so we have locations there where we can test that water. And so what we're talking about right here on this slide is that shallow unit, that first 30 feet that is most likely to be in contact part of the year with portions of the site. And in that unit, we do see arsenic and manganese at concentrations of potential concern. And because of that, we've been monitoring those, along with a few other metals, iron, and cobalt, and chromium. And more particularly, after that first risk assessment, we started looking at, well, in chromium, because the EPA evaluated all chromium as hexavalent chromium. Hexavalent chromium is an ion, is a particular ion of chromium that is more toxic than other forms of chromium. And they treated, just to be conservative, they treated all chromium the same. Well, that's not actually true. And so we went back and actually tested hexavalent chromium versus total chromium in the system, just to see how toxic is the chromium in the system. And so EPA is working on interpreting those data. Cobalt's in a few localized areas, behaves similarly to arsenic, iron, manganese, and all of these constituents, by the way, exist in the aquifer matrices, in the native natural materials. They exist in the settled materials at the site, in the wood pulp as well, at about the same concentrations that exist in natural materials at the site. So you can go down, you can go out to the site, dig a hole in the ground that doesn't have anything to do with the wastewater treatment system, and measure those metals, all of these metals. And then you can go into one of the basins that was a primary treatment basin where we settled out solvents from the wastewater before we did any other treatment. And you get the same concentration of iron, manganese, arsenic, cobalt, and chromium at the site. And that makes sense because it's mostly wood pulp at the site that's in these basins.
Can I just clarify real quick? The OU3 concentrations, groundwater concentrations of arsenic and manganese are orders of magnitude higher than groundwater concentrations in non-site groundwater and in river surface water.
That's right. That's right. So there's this dynamic going on out here, and it goes on in natural environments as well, where the reason that you have higher concentrations is because you have really low oxygen conditions in the water, in the wastewater treatment system. When you have really low oxygen conditions, those metals that are present in both wood pulp and in the natural environment dissolve into the water.
So in this conceptual model, then, are you saying that essentially the biological oxygen demand from decomposing all the organics on site, leading to this low oxygen groundwater, that is the reason why the site groundwater is high in arsenic and manganese?
That's correct.
Okay, well, it's a striking difference. It's
That's right.
orders of magnitude different than the concentrations in the surrounding groundwater.
That's right.
Okay.
It's also a textbook mechanism. So you can go anywhere in the world and see this type of mechanism going on. Yeah. So it's a physical characteristic of these metals. So we could replicate this system on a bench top in a laboratory. We could replicate it at another site, at another pulp mill, at a mine site. If we reduce the oxygen, we'll see these metals come into high concentrations into water. So that's what's happening at this site. Well, equally, if you increase the oxygen level, you see those go away. And the unique thing about this site, and maybe other places, but on either end of the spectrum, so if you have really reduced water, those metals go away. And if you have really oxygenated water, they go away. They don't go away, they stick to the solids. And if you're somewhere between those two places, they're in solution at really high concentrations, as you point out. So that's what's happening in the shallow groundwater at this site. And I think go ahead.
That's part of it. But just to flesh that conceptual model out fully, then as the groundwater flows toward the river end, at some point, the groundwater to river water interface is complex, and at some point it becomes oxygenated. Depending on the time of day, the time of year, the flow state could be in a different place, but that conceptual model would suggest that large amounts of manganese and arsenic in particular would be falling out of concentrations somewhere along that interface.
Exactly.
And if that's happening, have we found large amounts?
We are studying that mechanism right now, and we have it per year.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And you see that mechanism at the site. We see that mechanism in that location where the water comes up and then drops down, comes up and drops down. We can actually see a horizon where those metals come out of solution, because that water, any remaining water in that area that doesn't stay saturated,
Right.
those metals drop out because they have oxygen in them. All right. At the same time, those organic constituents, dioxins, trans, PCBs, are not high in groundwater, and for various reasons, but largely because they're just not soluble. They stick to the organics in the soils. They stick to the fiber and the lignin and all the other constituents, the humic material in these soils, and they just don't move. So if they are present on site, they are present in a localized area. This is the deep groundwater component. And we looked at deep groundwater obviously because you have the potential for the shallow groundwater to be in contact with the deep groundwater. And so we do have a number of monitoring wells on site, down gradient from the wastewater treatment system. And we're really not seeing any risk to that water from the site. And again, that's another finding from the original risk assessments, which will be reviewed and updated as needed. And then here's the river. All right, so as we were just talking about, there's this potential, right, for the river to be influenced by the site. And so we've been looking at the river, at all those metals over lots of time in lots of places. And up until, so the first risk assessments collected data up to 2020, and then they did the risk assessment. And then we started collecting data at the end of 2020, and then we'll be revising risk assessments as needed over, the last 4 years of data or so. But so that first data set, 2014 to 2020, suggested that manganese is elevated in the river. It was the only thing that EPA indicated was elevated and could be a constituent of potential concern. So they're still reviewing information. There's some uncertainty around that and other metals in the river, and we've been focusing our investigations to answer those questions. And that's where we are today. I say 2023, 2024 because we spent most of our time. We did some annual monitoring and semi-annual monitoring in 21 and 22, but mostly work spent on 2023 to present. So what's next? What's next is finishing up a remedial investigation and risk assessment documents, writing these things up in a report, and then using that information to establish some remedial objectives. So what needs to be cleaned up and where? And to what goal? Establish the goals. And then use that information then to plan a feasibility study where we identify a whole list of alternatives that would address those objectives. And then the study itself would evaluate those alternatives, all of them in some fashion. And it would use a series of 9 criteria then to rank them. And these criteria come directly from EPA's guidance. So we're back to this same roadmap and just pointing out where we are, and then the next potential public comment period here for this series of work. And I'm jumping to this one. This is a slide, I wish I could found, Elena had a really good slide on this months back.
Happy to send it to you.
Yeah, I should have asked you. I don't know where you found it, I went looking for it, but I liked it better because you can see the 9 criteria better. But here's the 9 criteria for evaluating remedial alternatives. So the whole feasibility study will be designed around collecting the data needed to evaluate against these criteria. And those criteria break down into sort of 3 main topics. Those are risk-based goals, comparing the alternatives. So will they meet risk-based goals? I think I lost my train of thought. Then this evaluation and balance this. Oh, I think my goal is messed up there. Are those alternatives feasible? And there's 5 ways to determine, are they actually feasible? Can we implement them? Are they cost effective? Are they effective over the long term? Do they actually reduce toxicity Do they have a short-term effectiveness? And then the last two are considering agency and stakeholder concerns. And I'm skipping along here a little bit so we can get back, so we don't get too far off. There were questions sort of on the tail end of the group that asked specifically how stakeholders could be more involved in learning about the site and the process and involved in components of the process itself. And we'll get to that a little bit more here, but in general, the circular process allows for stakeholder input all along with truly formal comment periods. And the next significant comment period here is at that proposed plan. I'm going to jump to the next slide because it actually has a bit more of a the EPA produced a community involvement plan. Boy, I want to say 2019, I think, is when it was finalized. I could be wrong. But they worked with the community. They collected a bunch of information. They conducted interviews and then identified a number of ways that they could communicate findings and collect community input along this process. And so those are boxed up on the right-hand side. There are certain things that the EPA has to do to communicate with the community, and then there are certain things that they've chosen to do, or at least offered to do, depending on how effective they are with the community. And those are at the bottom of that list there. But one thing in particular, the EPA has a service. I think I may have skipped over from the other one, but let me go back one slide so we can read. But they have this technical assistance services for communities that, and I've got a link in here, so let me share these. You can go to, or you can just Google it, which lays out all sorts of different ways that the EPA can help communicate information to stakeholders and involve stakeholders in this process. And in addition to that, the EPA has developed a website, including a community involvement page on that website, and they've put most of, if not all, the information. It is the better part of their administrative record for the project on the website, so you can access all of these documents. In addition to that, what's not listed here is there's a repository. I'm not sure
It's
where.
right out here.
Okay, all right. But still at the fire station here, printed documents. And in the event you do need to print out and you can't find it, you can certainly dial up Allie or the PRPs and we'll produce it for you. And the last bullet I've kind of hammered on a few too many times already, but once we get through the remedial investigation report, develop the feasibility study and report it, we'll produce a plan, a draft plan, and then involve the community in some feedback on that plan before any decisions are made.
Or EPA will produce the proposed plan.
Yes.
Yeah, the feasibility study will report, so with our remedial investigation report, there'll be a very similar type of report that comes out of the feasibility study report, and it will make recommendations for preferred alternatives. And then EPA will evaluate that and produce a plan.
So redevelopment planning means whatever the plan ends up being, how we will redevelop the area?
I threw that in there because I do have a lot of communication with MLH, who has much of the land at the site now. So they've succeeded M2 Green, and they have an important role in this process as well. They are interested in redeveloping the site, and there's an opportunity to, during redevelopment, to perhaps conduct some of the remediation. And that all depends on the outcome of the feasibility study and the proposed plan, of course, but there's an opportunity to dovetail redevelopment with remediation so that we can move along a little bit quicker. And it's important too, we'll write a reuse assessment. It's a requirement of the remedial investigation report we will write a reuse assessment, which broadly outlines potential reuse of the site. And it's important that we understand what the developer would like to do with the site and then make sure that it fits with the remedial strategy of the site. We wouldn't want them to come out and, try to produce some industry that just doesn't make any sense at all, or could potentially contaminate the property, or perhaps cause contamination to mobilize from the property. So that the MLH has suggested that, yeah, they're in a position now where they understand far enough along they can start talking to the community about redevelopment planning, and there's an opportunity for the CAG and the other community members to inquire about that, and perhaps work with that developer, at least share your interest for redevelopment of the site.
Dave, could you also just touch real quick on the 5-year reviews after everything is said and done?
Yeah, good point. That plays off of the sort of iterative nature of this whole process. At every step of the way, you're checking to make sure what we just did, can I confirm that I understand the conceptual site model? And then we do the feasibility study and we do a bunch of tests to make sure things are going to work. And then you sort of pilot study those things and see, are they working during the remediation action process? But then even after that, once you're really confident what you've got out there is working, you review it constantly for 5 years. Every 5 years, and write a report that says this is effective or it's not effective. And if it's not effective, then you make adjustments to ensure that it is effective.
And the EPA does theirs 5-year reviews.
Yes.
Yeah, to that point, as Jeannie and I were talking earlier, I've got one site, we just finished our 4th 5-year review, and I know Jeannie said that she's got one that just finished their 7th 5-year review. So these things go on and on and on to ensure that whatever the remedial solution was remains effective.
How did they, just out of curiosity, how did they come up with a 5-year? Just to, say something, it comes up, would they ever change that 5-year review process to be a shorter window if there were concerns?
Well, we're talking about the federal government.
Okay.
Yeah, Jerry, I believe it's actually in the law. It's a
Okay,
statutory.
I just wondered how that was
It's a
established,
statutory
why it
element
was
of the
a 5-year, and if there was a way that they would say, no, we're not gonna wait 5 years, we're gonna.
You could evaluate remedy performance outside of that 5-year window.
I just wondered if there was reconsideration of
During
the
that
5 years.
first 5 years.
Yeah.
And during that first 5 years, you're evaluating it much more frequently. And then it becomes a 5-year review. But in the event you have to make a change, they can increase the frequency of that review to ensure efficacy.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. So if you have groundwater monitoring long-term as part of the final decision, and at year 2, hey, I'm seeing something squirrely happen here. The expectation is we will take action at that point in time, figure out what's going on and change the remedial solution as appropriate.
Okay.
And 5-year reviews are tied to the type of remedy. So if you imagine a Superfund site that was just barrels of toxic material in a field, you went and you removed them and took them to a secure storage facility, and you could declare the site to have what we call unrestricted use and unlimited exposure, meaning it's completely safe for all uses. You could redevelop it in any way you wanted to. You could build a kid's playground on it. You wouldn't have to do 5-year reviews because you would have executed a remedy that reduced risk to such a manner that you didn't have to worry about it anymore. We don't really have Superfund sites like that. Out in Montana, we don't have any sites that have made it to that status. So that's where 5-year reviews exist. We've the remedy was designed to reduce risk to acceptable levels. It doesn't mean that there's no risk to any form of use on that site. Therefore, we have to monitor and continue to evaluate remedy performance until we reach that state.
Go ahead.
And other people are welcome to ask questions. I wasn't totally sure if the presentation was done and we're asking.
It is, yeah,
questions now.
let's jump into that.
Thanks. I didn't know if there was also a follow-up question about 5 years review. Is that what you had a question about?
Well, just basically the review.
Oh, okay, well, you can continue with that and I'll ask my question.
Well, being downstream and having the monitoring sites downstream and with those reviews and plus, just monitoring now, how much interaction are you doing or is anybody doing with the counties down below to let them know some of the risks and how it's been improved? And because I know we get so many people moving in now to the state that have no idea this even existed years ago and that there was a risk. And so is there some interaction with those counties? And I know it should be a little bit up to the county too, but some of them just don't realize even what's going on here.
Yeah, I'll default to Brianna, and then Mackenzie Meter is the community involvement coordinator for EPA. But I don't know, Brianna, if you want to, if
Yeah,
you're aware.
I think that would be more of a question for EPA, and I think it is kind of dependent on which type of risks we're seeing from the site, how those would be communicated. If there is a risk to downstream receptors, then that would be communicated more heavily and more regularly, but.
So like if the monitoring sites that they have downstream, something was really elevated, they would talk to people down below and say there is a risk
Yeah, definitely.
for eating fish and things like that.
For any system where you're testing some point of compliance, you'll have an indicator network upstream of that. So you have some warning, I'm going to exceed my concentration at my point of compliance before that. And so in theory, if you set up your network properly, you know ahead of time and you solve the problem before you impose any sort of risk on the environment or downstream beneficial uses. But if your question is about communication. And so, yeah, I'm not sure. I think Mackenzie Meter is the community involvement coordinator, and that definitely is something she'll be addressing as we get further along in the process. Oh, okay. Is it Shelley? Yeah.
So I have two questions. One was, does EPA have the resources to be able to contribute to this, given all the cuts that we've seen in the past, this past few months with this administration?
I think that's a question for EPA. The PRPs are committed within the administrative order to conduct the investigations and conduct the feasibility study and support risk assessment. So to support everything EPA needs in order to evaluate the site. But that's more of a question for EPA.
And they're not here.
Well, Catherine may be able to answer that, or someone online.
Yeah, we haven't seen any reduction in the amount of involvement, I would say.
Yeah, they've been very attentive. I haven't seen any change. In fact, we've appreciated that there haven't been changes in personnel because people have developed some institutional knowledge about the site, and that helps us move along much quicker.
Okay, my second question was, going back to the timeline, when I attended these meetings several years ago, we were ultimately talking about restoration of the site and restoration of the health of the river. And I see in one of the tables about the costs, and I know you're talking about the financial costs, but this is costing my people as a stakeholder our fishing rights. And that's our sustenance. And I don't know that we'll ever see healthy fish in the Clark Fork in my lifetime.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we can attribute the current advice about the river directly to this site, but most definitely there's concerns about the health of the ecosystem in the Clark Fork River. So this site is, the folks involved in this site are going through a process of investigating and trying to understand the risks to the river, and they will continue to do so. And we're very close at this point, it's taken some time. It takes a long time to collect quality data and make hard decisions, and so that's what's going on.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the presentation. That was really good. I appreciate your time coming to talk to the group. One thing I think it's important is a statement first, I'll make a question, but important to understand that this is all about characterizing the site as it currently is and the risk of the site as it currently is now to the environment. I wouldn't say it's ignoring the historical operation of the site, but it's kind of a separate question. And obviously they're connected, incredibly connected, because how the site was operated dictates how you currently sample for the site. I'll just try to ask a brief question, give other people a chance to answer, but you mentioned, but that connection I think is really important. I think it really also speaks to Shelby's Representative Fine's question too, is that you mentioned that a lot of the site, Special Operable Unit 3, was where the wastewater treatment occurred, and that met all the discharge permits and water quality standards. When were those water quality standards and discharge permits? When did that begin? Yeah, because the mill opened in 57.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a history of operation at the site, and there was a sort of sequential development of the wastewater treatment system between 1957 and, really in the ballpark of 1969 is about when that system was truly mature.
But the permits?
Yeah, the permits though were employed I remember the first permit I remember seeing is 84.
And when did bleaching occur?
Bleaching began in 69 and ended in 99.
And bleaching is responsible for dioxins in the environment.
It's
one of the largest, or the most
part of what's responsible, correct?
Yes. Yeah. But okay.
Yeah, that's an interesting question too, David. We helped to evaluate EPA's data set back in 2011, 2012, 2013 timeframe. The data set that they had produced in the preliminary assessments, and it really appears at the site that the little bit of dioxin content that's present out there is more present in ash from scrubbers, from environmental control devices at the site in the old stack scrubbers than it is from the bleaching facility. And I think that's interesting. We can actually see, because ash looks like wood smoke, and the bleaching facility has a very unique identity.
Sure, yeah.
And the little bit of dioxin we found out at the site looks more like ash than it does like bleach residue.
That is really interesting. And then that also speaks to the mitigation efforts that were going on there. The stack was a mitigation effort, right? And it was designed to cast those dioxins into the air.
Yeah,
get it off site.
No, it wasn't. I mean, it didn't cast dioxins in the air. What happened was the toxins formed in the stack, but they were then caught in the scrubbers.
With the scrubbers, right? With the scrubbers.
Yes.
Those were implemented in order to catch them. But nevertheless, stacks were designed to propel whatever you call it, ash or whatever.
Yes.
A comment on that real quick. Well, actually, I hadn't made my point yet, but so the air moves upstream, right? So like Dick Sheridan and others found that the Missoula Valley was affected by the operations of the mill. You just mentioned by dioxins, and it affected lichen communities, plant communities upstream. So when you use those sites as controls, are they really, unaffected by the mill?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a good question too. We evaluated that, the potential for that as well. During this investigation, we did multiple surface soils away from the mill to look to see if there were any sort of aerial deposits. We actually, EPA worked on a fact sheet that organized those data and discusses this topic as well. And we did not find evidence of the mill depositing dioxins upgradient from air
But I guess, yeah, I misspoke. I mean, I shouldn't say dioxins, they were just with those. But
Yeah.
like Dick Sheridan found, what was it, sulfur dioxide? That was
Okay.
the primary constituent from the mill.
I mean, there's work Tony Ward did in that arena as well.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. So sulfur, yeah, I take that back. It wasn't dioxins, but you mentioned dioxins. It just got me thinking of
Right.
ash and stuff deposited. But nevertheless, the mill affected areas upstream of the mill, and it was, that's what the stacks were designed to do, is get that off site, right?
I just wanted to comment on your, about dioxins forming from anti-ash and going out the stack. In 2008, we did extensive testing on the emissions from the stack, specifically for dioxin, because EPA at the time was proposing a new standard, and we were an order of magnitude below that standard without any specific technology to remove dioxin. There was that little being produced from the combustion process.
Yeah, I apologize. I was thinking sulfur dioxide, but you mentioned dioxin. And I know that the scrubbers were installed, again, to reduce, the deleterious effects of those emissions from the mill, right? Yeah. So prior to them being installed, emissions were higher.
For particulate matter.
Yeah. And it was particulate mainly settled.
Yeah, that was the biggest thing.
Upstream.
There was particulate.
Yeah, and, altered liking communities and forests and things, and it was attributed to the mill. And that's not like my work or anything like that. It's
right.
It's in the literature.
Other questions? Comments? Go ahead, Bruce.
Okay, well, I wonder if there's been any further discussion on floodplain mapping. And I continue to have concerns about a floodplain map that shows the secondary berms as the boundary of the floodplain. When you consider how these berms were constructed by digging out the area behind the berm and then refilling it with the residue from the mill, it just seems to me that those secondary berms aren't really an adequate floodplain boundary. And why that's of concern to me is the stuff that is bound in the soil that could be physically moved in a worst case flood event. And
yeah.
So I'm just like to bring that up as a thought again.
Yeah, fair enough. So the area behind this blue boundary line here, where the OU3 circle is residing, that's the floodplain. That's the 100-year floodplain. And then what Bruce is talking about, I think, and there's a series of interconnected dikes or berms that were originally designed to hold water away from the river. And then in addition to that, there's this road and berm all along the Clark Fork River itself. We call that the Clark Fork River berm. I don't have a map to show you those here today, but there are multiple ones in EPA's records. And so we call the one right along the river the Clark Fork River berm. And currently that berm is being inspected, and it has been demonstrated to be protective of the river from any potential material migrating from the site. Bruce is pointing out, though, that there's this, we're calling it an internal berm, and it's a series of interconnected dikes that separate some components of the primary wastewater treatment system and the secondary system from the floodplain. So those systems are outside the floodplain, and there's earthen berms between those systems, those ponds, and the floodplain. And Bruce, you're right. If in the event that you had some massive flood event, you would then be putting the floodplain at risk from those materials migrating. And so that is exactly a feasibility study type project, right? To evaluate the effectiveness of that berm to protect the floodplain from the materials behind it, or determine whether or not those materials need to be dealt with.
And that's kind of the connection I bring up about the downstream too, because if that island were to be taken out in a big flood event and that comes in, everything would be downstream beyond the mill, beyond Missoula County before you could ever do anything about it. So it all ties together. It's not just this project area, it's that downstream effects too, which kind of relates to the Bonner Mill when it was taken out, and that relates to the fishing as well. I mean, that had a big impact on the fish downstream.
So until a final remedy is decided, that work needs to be done. But in the meantime, EPA has employed contingencies to ensure the safety of the river and protection of the river from the site. And that's in a contingency plan. And part of that plan is that we go out and inspect that river berm to make sure it's effective, an effective barrier. And if there's any indication of failure, that's dealt with immediately. And that's all based on water levels. Water levels will trigger action at the site. So we have an effective means to protect the river while we're studying the site. Go ahead.
Thanks for the presentation. You mentioned MLH, and I guess I was curious about how potential redevelopment plans factor in, if at all, during the feasibility analysis, or like during the feasibility study.
Yeah, there's not much during the feasibility study, except that we could conceive ways to use redevelopment to employ a response action or employ a remedial action. So let's say we have to move earth, but MLH is planning to develop something that requires moving earth anyway. Then we'd take advantage of that. So we'd say, well, they're going to move earth. Let's make sure the timing works out when the earth needs to be moved, and they would move the earth.
So I guess from a community involvement perspective, do you think that it's important for the community and MLH, being the landowner, to, I guess, have as much conversation as possible on the front end of the PRP group working on the feasibility study? Because I'm just wondering if MLH's plans or hopes with the property do factor into the feasibility analysis. What I guess I'd hate to see is then after that feasibility analysis, I know it'll be out for public comment, but I'm wondering if the product out for public comment is going to be potentially further removed from what the community might want, and we're going to be in a position that, I guess, there's more discord.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the community should be providing feedback to the developer for his plans and to the EPA for the remedial plans. And I think, I would hope that if we've done everything right, when we get to a ROD, a record of decision, there are no surprises to the community, the EPA, or the owner operators. Anyone else? Okay, well, thanks everybody. Appreciate having us here.
Would you send your slides to Betty and Bruce and we'll make them available?
Yes, I will pass those. I'll probably pass them through Ally if that's all right. Just to make sure, yeah.
All right, so our next meeting is October 2nd is our next meeting. If you have suggestions for possible agenda items, our contact information is there. Thank you so much for your presentation. And if there's additional questions, if you want to just leave your contact information, people can go ahead and ask. So thanks, everybody.
Sure.
Do you want his presentation?
Good. Thank you very much.